I am so pleased to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, and it's just excellent timing to recognize our broadband winners for this year's awards and then have one of last year's award recipients here to give you your keynote address. I know you're going to enjoy very much hearing from someone from my home state of Minnesota, Minnesota Senator Matt Schmitt. Senator Schmitt was the recipient of the Community Broadband Hero of the Year last year, and he's from Red Wing, Minnesota, and was just elected to the Minnesota Senate in 2012, and went straight to the Senate, and has really been a rock star since he got there, in our NATOA world especially. Outside his official legislative duties, Senator Schmitt runs a small consulting firm, and of course he chairs several of the committees in the legislature that have to do with telecom, environment practices, agriculture, economic development, and the Senate Game and Fish Subcommittee. It says in his bio that he's a lifelong resident of Red Wing, and his academic background includes undergrad studies in biology and political science and graduate studies in economics and public policy. As I said, last year he received in St. Paul, Minnesota, our Broadband Hero of the Year award for courageously authoring and championing the Border-to-Border Broadband Fund bill that passed in the Minnesota legislature, securing $20 million in funding that helps remove barriers to opportunities for much-needed broadband development across the state. I went back and looked at the nomination form for when he was nominated for the award last year, and I thought I'd just give you a couple of sentences from that. It said, in an environment where funding for municipal and county broadband projects is scarce, municipal and county projects are being attacked in other parts of the country, and state legislatures are considering and passing legislation banning and restricting broadband projects. Minnesota was able to pass the border-to-border broadband bill with $20 million in matching grants for broadband projects. In addition, the legislation included in its definition for eligible recipients of the grants, city, county, and public-private partnership projects. He was also very involved in establishing the Office of Broadband in the state with a full-time director and a small staff. And that's another very important accomplishment in Minnesota. And this year, in the second year of the program, there's another $11 million for the matching program. And I know he'll tell you much more about that. He's here to talk about things that we can all learn across the country, and I know you'll really enjoy listening to Senator Schmitt. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you, Jody, for the gracious introduction, and it's nice to see you and so many other Minnesotans here today. I have to tell you, it kind of feels like August in Minnesota. It's rather balmy out there. So, again, I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be able to join you today. I joke that I never pass on an opportunity to talk about broadband. I think it is the conversation for the 21st century. The more conversations we have on this topic, the better off our communities and our world will be. So I guess I look to connect with you today. Of course, it was great to see many of you in Minnesota last year, along with Chairman Wheeler. I hope you found St. Paul and Minneapolis to be as welcoming as I found San Diego so far. So as you should know by now, Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, the home of Garrison Keillor's Prairie Home Companion, and the native soil of Paul Bunyan and his Blue Ox Babe. Let me tell you folks, Paul and Babe send their regards today. Now as for Mr. Keillor, he's long told listeners of a special place out there on the edge of the prairie. Of course, I'm talking about Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average. Indeed, we Minnesotans like to think we're above average. First, in labor force participation and employment. First, in % of women in the workforce. First, in ACT college entrance exam scores. first in graduation rates at our two-year colleges, and first in time spent commuting. Wait for it, with 65% of the population having commutes less than 30 minutes. That sounds like a great life. And according to CNBC, just this summer, Minnesota is the top state for business. The first high-tax, high-wage, union-friendly state to make the media outlet's top ratings. And because of all those lakes, Minnesota actually has more shoreline than California and Florida combined. Believe it or not, folks. So make your way to Minnesota again. So obviously there's a lot of things going very well in Minnesota. And again, we're thrilled that you were able to join us last year if you could. But woe is Lake Wobegon. Not all is lovely at the lake. There's limited connectivity at the cabin, intermittent internet outside the city, and certainly no broadband in all the land. A whopping 25% of homes in greater Minnesota lack access at very modest speed goals of 10 megabits per second down and 5 megabits per second up. Indeed, as Mr. Keeler likes to point out, Lake Wobegon is the little town that time forgot, and that decades have not improved, at least when it comes to high-speed internet access. Truth is, Lake Wobegon and Minnesota are hardly alone. Extending high-speed internet access has been a challenge throughout much of rural America, and even in many of the more densely populated areas in between. And unfortunately, it's a problem we've long been admiring, but with slow progress, much like the slow bandwidth we're forced to rely upon today. Over the past decade, Minnesota has commissioned 2 governor's task forces on broadband. So we're talking about this stuff, folks. The first task force was appointed by a former Republican governor, and among its many recommendations were a pair of goals and a deadline. By 2015, minimum speeds of at least 10 to 20 megabits per second download, and 5 to 10 megabits per second upload to all the homes and businesses in the state. And second, a less tangible but nonetheless important distinction as a leading state in broadband. In other words, we don't want to be in the middle of the pack anymore. We want to be leaders in broadband infrastructure, access, and adoption. These recommendations were adopted into statute by previous legislature, but little else came of its recommendations by way of legislation or attention, and that first task force ultimately disbanded. But in 2011, our current governor, a Democrat, appointed a new task force, and it continues to examine important aspects of connectivity and adoption, churn out meaningful recommendations, and promote the discussion and awareness throughout the state. Predating that first task force and continuing today, Minnesota has seen a tremendous amount of local energy and activity in broadband. Community after community has engaged in its own evaluation and goal setting, needs assessment, and feasibility study, often with the invaluable, rural-minded Blandin Foundation leading the way as a convener, a facilitator, a funder. But far too often over the years, in community after community, reality has failed to live up to vision, as barriers stand in the way of progress, lack of funding, partner opportunities or community-minded providers, outdated and burdensome regulation, and the unfavorable economics where expensive infrastructure and dispersed populations meet. This was my understanding of the issue when I took office in 2013. As a freshman legislator in a legislature brimming with experience and seniority, I wanted to be relevant. I wanted to contribute something meaningful in a meaningful way. And with respect to broadband, I thought I knew just enough to be dangerous. So that first year, we took a recent and importantly actionable recommendation from that broadband task force, and we pushed it hard. As Jody had mentioned, we created the Office of Broadband Development as a clearinghouse for all things broadband. After all, government can be pretty good at creating offices and staffing them. And I must admit, I certainly did not run for the state senate simply to grow government or solve a public policy problem with an appropriation. But nonetheless, the office was exactly what Minnesota needed: a credible source for immediate information, an intermediary among various state agencies, a conduit, if you will, between local stakeholders and state and federal help. In short, Minnesota needed a face, a phone number, a person who was on it when it came to broadband. In other words, we needed a doer to pair with our tremendously valuable deliberators. Importantly, we chose to house our Office of Broadband Development in the Department of Employment and Economic Development. First, we wanted to assure providers that this new office was primarily about extending opportunity rather than enforcing regulations. Second, we understood the vital importance broadband plays in our economy. Framing the discussion in terms of economic development simply made sense. And third, some of us anticipated a role for this office in directly assisting many communities with this great challenge in broadband deployment, the funding. Minnesota's Department of Economic Development and Employment, DEED, was accustomed to administering grant programs, and we knew they could handle an expanded scope. Importantly, Office of Broadband Development prepared Minnesotans to continue the important mapping work first commissioned through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. I fondly recall an economics professor back in grad school telling our class, folks, what gets measured gets done. When it comes to broadband, how could we possibly chart where we're going if we don't know where we are? Without doubt, the mapping work was a key contributor to Minnesota's progress in broadband. The connectivity conundrum was nothing more than qualifiable anecdote until we began quantifying the problem. And in Minnesota, mapping work has illustrated our strengths and our weaknesses. And through the Office of Broadband Development, it will continue. But opening an Office of Broadband Development was not the end of the discussion. Rather, it was the start. Now, following that, I think, productive 2013 legislative session where we created the Office of Broadband Development, we had an extensive round of briefings to local governments and civic groups in my own district that has since become a bit of a tradition. After all of that, I wanted to hear firsthand the stories that many communities around the state of Minnesota had to share when it came to broadband access. We had these anecdotes and stories floating around. I wanted to hear them firsthand. Well, between focusing on my own district and trying to maintain my own consulting work on the side, after all, Minnesota has a citizen legislature, we're part-time, we took this conversation out on the road in November, just as Minnesotans were preparing to hunker down for the winter. Now, during the week-long tour, we visited about 10 communities that each were keenly aware of the connectivity shortcomings. Business owners, school administrators, healthcare providers, local elected officials and economic development professionals, as well as local telecom, cable, and internet service providers, all were in attendance. And in many cases, my colleagues and the Senate or the House showed up to hear from their constituents as well. These meetings were tremendously successful, revealing great insights about the magnitude of Minnesota's broadband connectivity problem and ideas for how to address it. The takeaways were clear. First, Minnesota is a big and geographically diverse state. We can't simply promote a one-size-fits-all approach to the problem. Second, given the magnitude and complexity of the problem, we can't have a top-down approach. Rather, the state should serve as a facilitator or enabler and spur on local and regional solutions. And third, and this one I heard loud and clear, folks were sick and tired of talking about the problem. It was time for action. Well, the tour generated a lot of attention. And I have to tell you, in fact, our first meeting was held in Bemidji, the veritable home of Paul Bunyan and his Blue Ox. And a regional television crew was on hand, and the lead story of that nightly news was about broadband, ahead of Garrison Keillor's recent visit to Bemidji. So word got out about our tour, and requests came in from other communities around the state. They wanted to share their stories and engage in constructive dialogue about the issue. So we had to hit the road again. But with the holidays approaching, we set out to visit another 10 communities or so in January. Yes, you heard it right, an ambitious statewide road trip throughout Minnesota in January. Well, I remember the first stop of a newly minted border-to-border listening tour quite vividly. We were set to meet about 9 a.m. in the north-central city of Park Rapids. I'd stayed with my grandparents the night before in a neighboring Cuyuna Range, Crosby Ironton to be precise, and I barely got my Jeep to turn over that morning. It was that darn cold. Coldest day of the year, in fact, and the governor had just canceled public schools throughout this state. He closed them for the day. It was that cold. Perhaps I should have known that I should quit while I was ahead. It was too chilly for the children, too blustery for the buses, but not so for broadband. The schools were closed, but a diverse group of about 50 showed up for the discussion. And that morning, it set the tone for a very successful and well-attended round of meetings that week. It should be said, this was hardly the first broadband listening tour to take place in Minnesota, and I'm hardly the only person talking about it, and certainly not the first. Rather, I'm more like Johnny come lately to the discussion. But darn it, I want to have this discussion. And our tour's timing coincided with the lead up to the state's 2015 deadline for meeting its statewide speed goals. So timing was important. And importantly, it occurred at a time when political discourse was already focused on traditional infrastructure, such as roads and bridges. As much as I love my state of Minnesota and its 10,000 lakes, we're kind of becoming the land of 10,000 potholes. So infrastructure is something we have been talking about. Now we've got to act on that. So we were talking about infrastructure. And of course, and again importantly, Minnesota was also running a $1 billion budget surplus. As Minnesota's state economy was in full rebound following the Great Recession, more and more attention was being paid to the growing economic disparity between our metropolitan and regional economies and our less prosperous rural areas and communities throughout greater Minnesota. Things were coming together quite nicely. Growing awareness and editorial support across the state for addressing Minnesota's connectivity problem, an increasing focus on promoting rural prosperity, an unmet goal with an approaching deadline, a significant budget surplus, and, importantly, a growing coalition of support around the issue. Truly, it was the perfect storm for actually getting something done. I felt pretty good about what we'd accomplished already. Now, heading into the 2014 legislative session, the governor's task force had recently added a new recommendation, kind of at the 11th hour. Its recommendation to create a state-administered competitive grant program with an initial appropriation of $100 million. It sounded like a great idea to me, and we drafted that bill in short order. Of course, one of the early challenges we had was communicating the magnitude of the problem. After all, broadband infrastructure is a long-term investment with a long-term cost. And our task force estimated that it would cost between $1 and $3 billion to meet Minnesota's very modest state speed goals, depending on what kind of technology was utilized. It's such a cost, and given all the competing spending priorities for education, for healthcare, for roads and bridges, and sewer and water, the state wasn't possibly going to solve this problem by itself. However, Minnesota could send a strong signal that it takes the problem seriously and is doing something to address it. Now, another challenge that we continue to have with some legislators hinges on the very question of whether the state should be involved in promoting broadband access in the first place. After all, the state constitution stipulates that we fund our public schools and our traditional transportation infrastructure. That same state constitution is silent on the topic of telecommunications or broadband. Can't the private sector handle this one? At least that's what the critics contended, and some still contend that to this day. Well, what we have in Minnesota and elsewhere boils down to a good old market failure. The demand for broadband is significant, but spread out. The supply of private investment dollars is limited, and that's where our border-to-border broadband fund comes in. First, to infuse capital into projects serving hard-to-reach homes and businesses. Second, to give providers an opportunity to extend their return on investment, grow their service territories, or improve their level of service. And third, and folks, this is really important, to give communities an opportunity to compete in the 21st century. And that brings us to another takeaway from that listening session, that listening tour, I should mention. 20 communities in the depth of winter. A real estate agent's insight at our first meeting turned into a recurring theme, that communities are competing with one another, with other parts of the state and country, with other parts of the world, over the very issue of broadband connectivity. You see, as the real estate agent put it, it used to be that a family thinking about locating to a community would first ask about the quality of the schools. But nowadays, the first question that family asks, what's the internet connectivity like? That tells us a lot, especially in a state like Minnesota that really values its public education. That was a theme, folks. Meeting after meeting, discussion after discussion. Indisputably, broadband is a necessity, not simply a nicety. It's as vital to 21st century life as electricity or telephone service. It's essential, and policymakers should start to think of it as such. So whatever happened to Minnesota's border-to-border broadband fund, you asked? Jody, you gave us a little bit of a sneak peek. In 2014, we asked for $100 million. To jumpstart private and local investment in hard-to-serve areas. Now, after some resistance from more senior colleagues in the legislature who had other spending priorities of their own, we received a down payment, $20 million, on what needs to be a sustained and increasing significant state commitment. Now, following a thorough and relatively smooth application process, I tell you, the Office of Broadband Development is doing great work in Minnesota. That first round of funding resulted in 6,000 Minnesota homes, hundreds of businesses, and scores of community anchor institutions, such as schools, libraries, and hospitals, receiving connectivity and the service they need to succeed. As for round 2 funding, it's a different story here. Minnesota's new legislature kind of dropped the ball here. Rather than grow the fund by an additional $30 million, as the governor had proposed, or by the $100 million that I'd advocated, we followed 2 steps forward with 1 step back. And our round 2 funding shrank to about $11 million. Now, despite campaign promises and pledges of support, a renewed focus on rural Minnesota, a wildly successful first round of broadband funding, and another $1 billion plus budget surplus, misplaced priorities and misinformation ruled the 2015 legislative session. Rather than invest a portion of our state budget surplus in 21st century infrastructure, such as broadband, we were mired in those traditional tax cut and spending debates, and we kind of kicked the can forward. Rather than rally around our fund's early success and the opportunity to make significant gains, too many legislators bought into the notion that wireless technology would make hardwire connections obsolete, that there's a solution around the corner, that this investment in fiber is yesterday's news. Those of us who know better. That's the state of the conversation during this past legislative session. And to be sure, wireless access and the Internet of Things is our future. Heck, folks, it's our present. But for those interested in starting a home-based business, taking advantage of flexible work schedules or telecommuting, participating in distance learning or telehealth, wireless is a great complement, but it's not a competitor for hardwired service such as fiber. Now, despite Minnesota's step backwards on broadband, I remain incredibly optimistic and hopeful that we're going to continue to grow our momentum moving forward. In just a couple short years, we've raised this issue on the map in Minnesota discussions. I'm not the only one going around the state talking about broadband, and that's a good thing. Some of these communities may be getting sick and tired of seeing me, but I'll tell you what, more folks are talking about broadband, and it's becoming an issue that they don't not only campaign on, but they want to deliver on in our legislative sessions. And recently, we had Minnesota's Farm Fest. It's a trade show, essentially. It's a big deal up in Egg Country. 3 days in rural Minnesota. The first day of Farm Fest was devoted to rural broadband. And they asked us, not me, but the Office of Broadband Development, to continue to be part of that conversation moving forward so that we can talk about broadband in a meaningful way in an important gathering in Minnesota, perhaps our premier political gathering of the year. And so I'm incredibly optimistic that we have elevated this issue, that we've started this train of momentum moving forward. And even though we may take a step back, we're going to continue to take steps forward. And what we need to do is we need to put our money where our mouth is. We can't talk about ubiquitous service. We can't talk about meeting modest but worthwhile and meaningful state speed goals without getting the state involved, trying to promote partnerships, private and local investment where it does the trick, in tackling this problem. Because folks, we're 15 years into the 21st century, and we're still having huge problems with connectivity. And this isn't just in rural Minnesota or rural America. It's a block or two or a mile outside of town. And when you talk to your schools, you can't go to one-to-one initiatives or flip schedules without that access being available to all students. With telehealth and the cost savings and the quality of life it offers, you can't possibly achieve those ends without access outside of core cities. Not to mention economic development. Talk about starting home-based businesses, or in Minnesota, tapping into the economic potential, creativity of all corners of the state. You can't do that if you don't have connectivity in all corners of the state. Now, I'm from Red Wing, home of Red Wing shoes. I'm wearing my pair right now. Red Wing pottery, if you have some of that at home. We're about about a half hour, maybe 25 miles downriver from Hastings, you saw me up here, or South Washington County. But about 45 miles to our southwest is Mayo Clinic. Huge economic driver in Minnesota, with a promise of 30,000 new jobs in the next 10 to 15 years because of our investment in the Destination Medical Center concept. It's world-renowned, and it's going to be more so in the years ahead. Great opportunity for folks to be able to telework or engage in flexible work schedules, adding value and enhancing our lives. But you can't work from home if you don't have connectivity that's reliable. You have to have that hardwire connection. And the same holds true for those potential home-based businesses that might start up in somebody's garage or spare bedroom and turn into an economic driver for a small-town community in any part of the state or any part of the country. And so, again, in bringing this to a close, I don't want to be senatorial and filibuster our afternoon. There's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. And even though Minnesota took 2 steps forward and 1 step back, we're going to continue pushing this issue hard. And I hope states around the country continue to do so. This is the economic driver of the 21st century. And as I like to look at it, it is the great equalizer for greater Minnesota. Thank you very much.